Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in AP English. We turn now in our novels study to Conrad's Heart of Darkness. That's Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Boy, guys, one of maybe the most controversial titles that we study together in 303. We don't really call this a novel, we call it a novella. Some have referred to it almost like an extended short story. Published in 1899. I mean, just think about that as your date, right? It's, right at the beginning of the 20th century. Many have called this the novella of the 20th century. Certainly, this one is going to, it's going to have tremendous influence, both positive as well as negative. I mean, remember what we've said many, many times. If we are the stories that we tell, if we are the stories that we retell, the stories we accept, we're also the stories we reject. And this is a novel, or a novella, that has for many, many years been hotly debated within the Academy. We study it in AP English for any number of reasons. I mean, it's such an amazing text on so many levels. And for those of you that are film buffs, if you know Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, you already know the storyline of Heart of Darkness by virtue of the film itself, okay? Now, of all the things that I could say about this amazing, amazing novella, one of the most amazing things has to do with Joseph Conrad, who is going to be born Polish and doesn't even speak English until he's in his 20s, and then he becomes the master prose stylist, maybe one of the best of all time. And that would be like asking one of you to pick up the study of Russian in your 20s. You would learn it, and then you would write novels well enough in Russian that you would be given equal status with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. That's what this cat pulls off. So let's just say it right away. This is going to be an amazing guy. Let's get on with some biography and then a study of the novella quickly. He is born the 3rd of December, 1857, and he dies August the 3rd, 1924. He spent so much of his life on boats at sea as a mariner, and his classic novel, Lord Jim, as well as one of the greatest short stories he wrote, O Youth, are going to draw heavily, heavily from that. He also spent quite a bit of time in Asia and Southeast Asia. We do have a title called Lagoon that we teach, and I've lectured on LearnStrong.net in the Senior B folder. His prophetic voice, though, is what really gives so many of us pause. I mean, go back and take a look at what I said about Yeats' second coming, at LearnStrong.net. The center cannot hold, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So much of that prophetic voice seems in many ways to have started with this very disturbing journey into the heart of darkness, into the heart of Africa. Certainly, Conrad predicted the fall of empire, certainly predicted the rise of totalitarian states, and I think maybe most importantly for a writer like T.S. Eliot, it was really Conrad who gestured at that notion of alienation, as we often will refer to it. Think of it this way, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, 1922, we have full lectures on that, and my assumption is that when you're working with Heart of Darkness, that you already have some of that other background knowledge with you as well. 1922 is 20 years after the publishing of Heart of Darkness. Think about this, and for those of you that are going, man, I know I heard about Conrad another way through T.S. Eliot, that's because at the very beginning of The Hollow Man, you'll remember that we have that little epigram there, that little saying, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, at the very beginning of Heart of Darkness. And yes, again, on LearnStrong.net, I do give full lectures as well on Heart of Darkness, I'm sorry, on Hollow Man. And I definitely am assuming a number of things here as I begin this lecture with you. The first major assumption, we have to say it out loud, is always our learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We do that in our annotative process at level 1 by asking, what does the text say? Summarizing, which, by the way, is not always so easy with a really dense, and that's going to be an important adjective for us, a dense text like Heart of Darkness. Then at level 2 we ask, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages, along with our big 5. That is to say, what does this text say about epistemology and what you can know, ontology and who you are, psychology and the workings of the individual mind, sociology and the power of the group, and then finally, theodicy, the question of evil in a universe. This text is going to raise that question profoundly, and we'll have to maybe try to address it. Of course, along with themes and messages in 2B, we'll ask the rhetorical question, not what Conrad says, but how Conrad says it. In my very early years in AP teaching this novel, a student came to me and said, you know, there's something really weird about what's going on when you read the words of Heart of Darkness out loud. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, last night a group of us got together and we were working with this novella, and so I just started reading it out loud so we could get a flavor of what was going on. And I noticed there was a certain kind of rhythm in the prose that seemed to almost equate the rhythm of a boat that is moored to a dock and is kind of rocking back and forth. Do you think he meant to do that on purpose? I'm like, get out of here. Are you serious with me? I had read all kinds of research and scholars on this, and not one of them had ever pointed out what my student actually pointed out to be true. The rhythms of the prose are, in fact, rocking rhythms, along with the very dense kinds of constructions syntactically that we'll get into. In fact, I'm going to share a number of lines from this novella. I'll read them out loud to kind of prove what I'm saying to be true. At 3B, though, or at 2B, the rhetorical techniques, not just the narrative technique, we're also going to ask about symbolism and irony as being two of the important talking points for us. And then finally at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to information like this? That is to say, don't just take my word that this is an amazing novella. Read it and figure it out for yourself. Don't just reject it because it ended up on some list of banned books or books that are no longer politically correct. I think that's an important point to be made here about Conrad's work. Conrad, like any writer, is a product of a time period, a product of a generation. And we obviously want to take him at face value given his time period and you know, the possible racism of this text. I say possible, it's patently racist. But the question for us is, can we read a racist text and draw something important from it? I think we can. I think we should. And at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information? First of all, as it relates to other titles that we've taught, and you're going to see so much subsumed of everything that we've worked with from Homer on. I mean, we're going to have a quest, just like the Odyssey, just like Aeneas in the Iliad, and on it's going to go. Finally, at 3B, I want to ask you to challenge yourself to relate somehow personally to a title like this, the ways in which it works for you, the ways in which it disturbs you. And I think it has to disturb us. I mean, this is one of those readings that has to disturb us on some level. Now, the other assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net in the AP folder, as well as the fact that you're going to have read this material on your own before you come to us for some help here and maybe some guidance. Let's begin. I want to actually start in the opening lines of this thing. We meet our storyteller, Marlowe, and narrative technique, let's just get this out of the way. You've got Conrad writing a story about a guy named Marlowe who's sitting on a boat moored at the Thames River in London, and he starts to muse or tell a story out loud about something that he experienced many, many years prior. So you've got that onion layering, or for the Shrek fans in the house, that parfait layering effect, just like Chaucer will play a similar game in Canterbury Tales. The opening lines of this novella will introduce us to Marlowe. We're told that Marlowe sat cross-legged right aft, leaning against the mizzenmast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion. Put it in your notes right now. Colors are going to matter in this text, and they're often going to be paradoxical in nature. What you normally think that yellow stands for, represents, or white represents, or black represents, will often be its exact opposite. A yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and with his arms drooped, the palms of hands outwards, resembled an idol. Now this Buddha reference, referencing to the Buddha, we're going to hear more about in a second. And now we jump on, a few lines later. The sun set. The dusk fell on the street. The lights began to appear along the shore. Already maybe you can hear a certain kind of rocking in the prose. The Chapman Lighthouse, a three-legged thing erect on a mud flat, shone strongly. Lights of ships moved in the fairway. A great stir of lights going up and going down. And further west, on the upper reaches, the place of the monstrous town was still marked ominously on the sky. Notice the adjectives. A monstrous town is what London is. A brooding gloom in sunshine, a lurid glare under the stars. Pay attention to his adjectives. We've said this before. If you want to be a really fine writer, you got to pay attention to your adjectives and your verbs. And Conrad, genius at this kind of thing. It amazes me every time I teach this novella that he did not learn English until the second decade of his life and on into it. And now to begin with Marlowe. And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. He was the only man of us who still followed the sea. The worst that could be said of him was that he did not represent his class. He was a seaman, but he was a wanderer too, while most seamen led, if one may so express it, a sedentary life. Think of Odysseus right away. Their minds are of the stay-at-home order, and their home is always with them. The ship, and so is their country. The sea. One ship is very much like another, and the sea is always the same. In the immutability of their surroundings, the foreign shores, the foreign faces, this is significant, this repeating, the changing immensity of life glide past, veiled not by a sense of mystery, but by a slightly disdainful ignorance. For there is nothing mysterious to a seaman unless it be the sea itself, which is the mystery of his existence and as inscrutable as destiny. Destiny, by the way, capitalized. For the rest, after his hours of work, a casual stroll or a casual spree on shore suffices to uphold for him the secret of a whole continent, and generally he finds the secret not worth knowing. The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlowe was not typical, if his propensity to spin yarns be accepted. And to him, the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze in the lightness of one of these misty halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illumination of moonshine. His remark did not seem at all surprising. It was just like Marlowe. It was accepted in silence. No one took the trouble to grunt even, and presently he said, very slow, "I was thinking of very old times, when the Romans first came here." We're in London, right? 1900 years ago. The other day, light came out of this river since, you say, nights? Yes, but it's like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. Imagine the feelings of a commander of a fine, what you call treatment in a Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north, run overland across the Gauls in a hurry, put in charge of one of those crafts, the legionaries, a wonderful lot of handymen they must have been used to build, apparently about 100 or in a month or two, if we may believe what we read. Imagine him here, the very end of the world, a sea the color of lead, a sky the color of smoke, a kind of ship about as rigid as Coturnian. And going up this river with stores or orders or what you like, sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages, precious little to eat, fit for a civilized man, nothing but Thames water to drink. By the way, the savages and the whole civilization, these are all tensions that are going to be constructed in this novella. Here and there a military camp, lost in a wilderness like a needle in a bundle of hay, cold, fog, tempest, disease, exile, death. We could be talking about Odysseus, of course. He's talking, of course, about Roman soldiers who have come to England. Death skulking in the air, in the water, in the bush. Now, put it in your notes. One of the things that Conrad's going to be talking about is conquest. Civilizations that will colonize another civilization. And his argument is that it is as old as humans. Right? They must have been dying like flies here. Oh, yes. He did it. Did it very well, too, no doubt, and without thinking much about it either, except afterwards to brag of what he had done through his time, perhaps. They were men enough to face the darkness. And perhaps he was cheered by keeping his eye on a chance of promotion to the fleet at Ravenna by and by. And if he had good friends in Rome and survived the awful climate, or think of a decent young citizen in a toga, perhaps too much dice, you know. No, coming out here in the train of some prefect or tax gatherer or trader even to mend his fortunes, land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery had closed around him, all that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. Notice your trinities as well. Back to our St. Augustine comments. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He was to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. And it was, and it has a fascination too that goes to work upon him. The fascination of the abomination, you know. Imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. He paused. So notice Marlowe, almost like a soliloquy in a Shakespeare play, so much of Hamlet is going to be, and Shakespeare's other great tragedies are going to be represented here. Mind, he began again, lifting one arm from the elbow, the palm of the hand outwards, so that with his legs folded before him, he had the pose of a Buddha preaching in European clothes and without a lotus flower. Mind, none of us would feel exactly like this. What saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency, but these chaps were not much account, really. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force, nothing to boast of when you have to, since your strength is just an ancient arising from the weaknesses of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. Notice, he reduces all of amazing Roman Empire history down to nothing more than violent grab bag, bullying behavior. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter nose than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it much. It's a powerful line. I mean, I think for those who read this novella as nothing more than a piece of racist propaganda, I think you've got to pay attention to lines like this, because I think Conrad's making a very powerful point. Imagine it, writing it right at the beginning of the 20th century, and the fall of certain empires and the rise of others, right? What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. Well, Marlowe begins to tell his story. And his story is a compelling story of basically 3 parts. Part 1, before he arrives in Africa. Part 2, as he goes up the Congo to find some enigmatic guy named Kurtz. And then finally, part 3, he comes back. He takes a job as a riverboat captain. He tells this story, right? For the rest of the novella now, with brief exceptions in the break in the story. He's basically telling us a story. So you got Conrad, through some kind of a narrator who's never named, telling us about this guy named Marlowe who is telling the story. Almost 4 removed, think about the brilliance of that narrative construction. He takes a job as a riverboat captain with a company, a Belgian company, right, organized to trade in the Congo. He travels to Africa, then up the Congo. Marlowe encounters all kinds of inefficiency, brutality in the company stations. And then he finds himself meeting the native inhabitants of the region for the first time. They are forced to have to work and to die. The descriptions, I'm going to argue, are some of the most compelling that we read together in 303. I'm taking our time reading this material to you for 2 reasons. One, I love to read Conrad out loud. I think my student was right. How I learn from my students, from you guys, is quite amazing. And yes, it is true. There is some powerful rhythms in the prose. But I think the other reason is because we've read our Dante. And so when we come to, now we'll call the Grove scene, the famous Grove scene of I almost called it Paradise Lost for reasons that will become apparent when we start to read this. Some of the Miltonic rhythms are going to be a part of this. But the Grove scene is going to remind us a lot of Dante, and especially Inferno. At last, we open to reach. By the way, this is hard material to read. It's hard because it's so dense in its structure, but it's also hard because it's so sad. A rocky cliff appeared, mounds of turned up earth by the shore, houses on a hill, others with iron roofs amongst a waste of excavations or hanging to the declivity. A continuous noise of the rapids above hovered over the scene of inhabited devastation. A lot of people, mostly black and naked, moved about like ants. A jetty projected into the river. A blinding sunlight drowned all this at times in a sudden recandescence of glare. It's hard to see. "There's your captain's station," said the Swede, pointing to the 3 wooden barrack-like structures on a rocky slope. "I will send your things up. 4 boxes, did you say? So, farewell." I came upon a boiler, wallowing in the grass, then found a path leading up the hill. It turned aside for the boulders and also for an undersized railway truck lying there on its back with its wheels in the air. The symbolism is powerful. This is what conquest now looks like for Conrad. It's shambles. It is Milton's pandemonium gone awry. One was off. The thing looked as dead as the carcass of some animal. Reading Conrad's Heart of Darkness and paying attention to the similes, a number of writers have done it, and I think you should as well. I came upon more pieces of decaying machinery, a stack of rusty rails. To the left, a clump of trees made a shady spot where dark things seemed to stir feebly. I blinked. The path was steep. A horn tooted to the right, and I saw the black people run. A heavy and dull detonation shook the ground. A puff of smoke came out of the cliff, and that was all. No change appeared on the face of the rock. They were building a railway. The cliff was not in the way or anything, but this objectless blasting was all the work going on. A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets full of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound round their loins, and the short ends behind raggled to and fro